The 50 Podcast.
50 Podcast.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the 50 Podcast. Today I'm here with Kris Healey, coming from his closet. Talking, I'm like, if I had a closet that I could fit in, I would do the same. It's really a lot better for sound, and he has dogs, and I'm just so excited to have him here. I'm really excited to pick his brain. But he is a former 1811 special agent, tactics and resilience educator. He's an author, public speaker, podcast host, and most importantly, a family man. So for our listeners who don't know who you are, can you give them a quick bio about yourself? And after, we will peel back all the layers that we just talked about and more. So you have the floor.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks for having me, first of all. I got my start with Immigration and Customs Enforcement back in 2006. I got hired on. So originally, I was a archaeologist. I got out of college in 2001. I was an archaeologist. I was working in the field for one of my professors when 9/11 happened, and it kind of changed my focus about what I wanted to do with my career. And I had to wait out the hiring freeze, and they stood up DHS and started hiring all these jobs, and I applied for Border Patrol and CBP and Immigration and Customs Enforcement, got hired on, got sent down from my home in New England all the way down to the southwest border. And I spent the next 15 years working for DHS, first with ICE for about 3.5 years, and then the last 12 years of my career I was with Department of Homeland Security Office of Inspector General, which is the investigative branch of DHS that looks into all of the public corruption, all the fraud, waste, and abuse, any misuse of funds, any corrupt Border Patrol agents, CBP officers, TSA. So I did that sort of work for the last 12.5 years of my career. Wow. And then I left, went to the private sector. I got very fortunate. My wife has a very successful consulting business that she was able to grow while I was out kicking doors in. And we kind of went through a bit of a family tragedy. We had my father-in-law had survived cancer. He got sick again in 2021, late 2021, and we realized we only had so much time left with him. And so that kind of facilitated me leaving. I said, this is an opportunity for me to go serve in my wife's business and be there for her and for my kids and for my family as we're going through end-of-life care. So that's when I left the federal government. Now I do things like this. I consult, and I do appearances, and I do speaking, and I talk about what I did in federal law enforcement, hopefully help other people who are still in the field have better mindsets and have better tactics for surviving the job.
Yeah. And the reason someone like me has followed you and is so excited to talk to you, because you are so vulnerable. And I think a lot of men in your position aren't as open to being so vulnerable. And like I mentioned, you're such a family man, and a lot of the things that you had just mentioned, you also talk about in your book that we'll talk about in a little bit. But I do think that it's so important to humanize people like you who, like you said, I'm kicking down doors, but I'm also putting my family first. And I think it's really important to show those sides to people like you. So I'm really excited to talk to you.
I appreciate that. I think there's a lot of folks out there in this career that feel like they have to make that choice between
yes.
Wrapping themselves in the flag, wrapping themselves in the job, and being a family person. And of course, I came into, like most people, I entered law enforcement in my 20s. I wasn't married. I didn't have kids. I was it was all about what I wanted to do. And, if it was fun and if it was fast and dangerous, I wanted to be involved in it. And, by the time I left my career, I was the father of 2 children, and their needs were coming first. And the idea of getting up at 5 a.m. to go kick a door down in a bad neighborhood in Houston, and, dealing with gang members and dealing with danger and all of those things, not knowing what the future might bring, that set heavy on me. And I think we all get to that point in our careers where family becomes the greater focus. We have to mature and change with the careers. And so I think it's important to have those discussions with people who are in the field right now. We didn't talk about that when I was at the academy. I'm sure you didn't either.
Oh.
So life does change, and you have to adjust how you approach this career as your life changes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I totally respect that. And it's like you said, as we grow up, our priorities change.
Yeah.
So we're going to go over first about your foundation in the first responder law enforcement, and how you got there. I like to ask every guest I have how their family life and growing up was, because I find it so interesting, like what your background is and how you kind of get to the place that you're at. So tell us about your family life and growing up.
Yeah, sure. I grew up, we were talking offline, but I'm an Illinois native. So I was, yeah, I was born in Kankakee. So my parents are from the western suburbs outside of Chicago, but we moved when I was really little. So I grew up in New England. I grew up in southern Maine. You're not going to meet a lot of people from Maine because there's only about 2 million of us. And
I don't think I've ever met.
yeah, so I had a small town experience, just a kid growing up in Maine, and a really idyllic life. And I went off to college at the University of Maine. I intended to study archaeology. I knew what I wanted to do with my life, and then 9/11 happened, and I had kind of an awakening. That was kind of a political awakening for me. I understood for the first time really kind of the consequences of policy, of immigration policy, of things like that. I got really involved in pursuing a career in immigration law enforcement because I saw a bunch of people come into the country on visas, overstay those visas, and then attack us from within. And that became very important to me. And so I set aside my archaeology career. I had gone back to graduate school. I had intended to pursue a PhD. I was going to go the whole way. I was going to be a Dr. Jones, Indiana Jones. But it just was so important to me to pursue that I got singularly focused, and I ended up uprooting away from everyone I knew, my friends, family. Everyone moved 2,600 miles away from home, from the northern border to the southern border. But I had a great home life. I mean, I grew up, I know there's a lot of people who, for law enforcement, it's a trauma response. We want to go and serve because of something we experienced. Mm-hmm. And I know I could name dozens of people that I served with who had that exact experience. They grew up in a tough household, and the police were always there when mom and dad were fighting or something bad was happening, and they saw them as heroes and wanted to be like them. I had a similar experience, but for me, it was watching those towers fall on 9/11. It was watching law enforcement officers and firemen and paramedics running towards this catastrophe as everyone else is running away, trying to make order out of chaos. That was incredibly appealing to me. And I felt like being a 21, 22-year-old kid at the time that I was that demographic that needed to serve, that needed to step up and be part of this response. And so that was really what it was for me.
And you said you applied to like a ton of places. When you were doing those applications after being in college and going to school for archaeology, how did your family feel about that? Were they like really like what's going on, or supportive or surprised? How was that?
I would say lukewarm. I remember
9/11, they were probably like, oh my gosh, our son's going to go do that.
I was firstborn. And so when you're the firstborn, you tend to be, maybe helicopter parented a little bit more than my little sister was
too. So I understand.
Yeah, so yeah. And so there was a lot of trepidation. My parents, we didn't have law enforcement in the family. We didn't have a military background. So there was no real, grounding in that for either of my parents. And so, the biggest question was why? Why do you want to do that? And, and I explained it just like I did with you. Like I felt compelled, and I had other friends. There's a great photograph I have from right after 9/11. My birthday was the day after. And so my best friend, one of my best friends in college, his birthday was the 11th, mine was the 12th. And we always had kind of a joint party together. And so I went up to visit my friends that weekend. 9/11 happened on a Tuesday. I went up on like Friday to the University of Maine where they were all still enrolled. And we had kind of a gathering, and it was a pretty somber affair. And there's a picture taken of several of us sitting there together, kind of, just drinking a beer and just kind of talking about what had just occurred. And I look at that picture, and the 5 of us who were in that picture, 3 went into law enforcement, 2 went into the Army. And so I was
going to ask. That's crazy.
It was one of those things where my entire peer group, all of us, like from the days after 9/11, it was important to all of us to make that the response to that a part of our lives. And so it was less about, I think for me, like the pressure from my parents wasn't so much, I never thought twice about going in that direction because my peer group all made that same decision. We all said, no, this is, we're going to be a part of the response to this. And so, right. That I moved away from home, 20 years ago now. It's been a long time, but, they're still in New England, and I think they still don't understand exactly what I did with my life because they don't ask a ton of questions about it. And I totally get that because
that's fair. And I feel like your career path, it's hard to ask questions too, because it's not like you're a police officer.
Right.
So it's like totally different, and it's kind of like undercover. Like people don't really know exactly what you guys do on a day-to-day basis, and I'm sure it changes a lot. But what you mentioned, but if you can touch on it a little bit, what units or departments have you worked for?
Yeah.
And if you can pick a favorite, can you tell us about your favorite experience or role?
So I started out, as I said, just getting into the immigration law enforcement side of things. I wanted to be part of tracking down whoever was still in the country who was planning the next 9/11. And so at the time, ICE was a brand new agency. It stood up in 2004. They had this major hiring freeze. They reorganized the federal government. They created this new department and all these new agencies. And so ICE was kind of crammed together from the legacy customs and legacy INS, and they put it together in this new agency. And my job as an ICE agent was to arrest fugitive aliens. It was to put them through kind of like a deputy marshal sort of position. You arrest a fugitive, you put them through the immigration process, and then you remove them to their home country. So I got to travel all over the world. I got to take people back to
I learned
Venezuela.
that when doing my research on you, which is another question I'll ask later, but that's so cool.
So I got to see some, not any real, I mean, I got to go to England and Portugal. I got to go to some good places, don't get me wrong, but like, and Germany, but like, I also got to go to like Nicaragua and Venezuela and Guatemala like 100 times, and Honduras and El Salvador. So I got to be in some like tough spots too.
Ooh, El Salvador, yeah.
I spent a lot of time in El Salvador. Yeah, it's much better now, but
it is.
Yeah, I got some great stories about all of that, and it was fun. I was basically on the Con Air flights. I would be taking, 100, however many people you can fit a 737, like 130 people, all MS-13s back into El Salvador. And so, so some interesting work. And then while I was doing that, I did some work within some of the ICE detention centers. I would go in and interview people, and I was kind of overseeing contractors. That was one of my collateral duties. And I got some intel when I was doing that I shared with the internal affairs agents in the Rio Grande Valley about a smuggling network that was bringing stuff into one of these detention centers. And we ended up busting like 8 or 9 guards. And these guys happened to have a vacancy, a special agent vacancy coming up in their office. And they said, hey, you're pretty good at developing sources and doing this sort of work. Would you like to come work for us? And I went to work for them for the rest of my career. That work was probably more aligned with what I like to do. I loved doing the big, large, gnarly, transnational fraud investigations, the kind of stuff that, you would scratch the surface, you didn't know where it was going to go. And I would love to bring like a big case across the finish line that nobody thought I could do. That to me was what I loved to do. So I enjoyed everything I did as a federal agent, whether with ICE or as an investigator, but that was what I enjoyed the most.
That is so cool. Like, it's so interesting. And especially because you did it like previously, and obviously we won't get too deep into it, but what's happening now in our country, it's like probably very frustrating for you with all the work that you had put in, and probably a very full circle moment. And I think it's really important for you to share your voice. And I'm so excited that I have you here because again, what's going on right now and the work you've done it's so wild to me. This is so cool.
There's two things. Like I go on a lot of news shows. I've been on a lot of podcasts, but I go on a lot of, I do live interviews.
Your voice is so important for this stuff.
Well, I have a somewhat unique experience for the current moment, I guess. And, I spent 10 years on the Southwest border. Where you see all the chaos happening, I was there. When you talk about quote unquote kids in cages, I've been in those cages. I've been there. When you talk about, different border crossings in Del Rio or Laredo or McAllen or Brownsville, I've been to all of them. I was part of all of that. I responded to public corruption. I was part of the Panama unit case, which is one of the biggest, kind of most famous public corruption cases of the Hidalgo County sheriff getting taken down. And so I lived this experience for 10 years, which is fascinating to me to kind of look back on it through the lens of what's happening now. And then on the other side of my career, I was investigating DHS entities when there was corruption. So Secret Service, the Cartagena scandal in Colombia, my colleagues and I were part of, the investigation of that. My agency led that investigation. And so what we're seeing right now, both with what happened in Pennsylvania and then again what happened this weekend, my agency that I work for is leading the investigation into the security failures. And so I have somewhat of a I don't want to say a charmed life because these are not good things. I'd rather, the board be secure and the president or former president be secure. But at the same time, I have the opportunity to kind of give people perspective because there's a lot of voices out there who don't have that experience. So to give that perspective, it's been a blessing.
And do you have a little bit of FOMO? Do you know what FOMO is?
Yeah. My kids tell me what it is.
Yeah. Because like what you used to do is back and like so prevalent. And like you said, like your friends or like your former job, they're like have to be like in it right now. Like, are you getting a little FOMO? Like, I wish I was there, or are you good?
There are times, I mean, I miss the job all the time because I loved what I did and I was very good at it. And anything that you're good at, I imagine it's a little bit like retiring from your career as a professional athlete, right? You look at people doing it, you're like, I remember when, and you think about
and if it's like so big on TV or like the biggest thing, you're like, man, I want to get back in there,
There's a bit of that, but for me, I think what stands out the most about the current environment we're in is, I was a special agent. When I hear special agent on television now, it's often in regards to a politicized investigation or a massive screw up or a scandal involving the FBI or the Secret Service. And I get upset. And I actually had this conversation with my wife the other day. I get upset about how that title is diminished by the actions of a handful of bad people. And then I look at stuff like the IRS whistleblowers who blew the whistle on the case involving the president's son, and I say I get fired up about stuff like that because I'm like, those are guys who are making the profession what it should be. Those are guys who are standing up and saying the government's doing the wrong thing, and I'll put my badge on the line to make sure they do the right thing. That fires me up much more than, I don't need to be back down there on the border. I spent more than enough time on that wall. There's young guys out there, young cats out there that can do that. But I see all the stuff in the news, and I'm glad to still have a voice and be able to actually. I spent 15 years of not being on social media, of not putting my voice out there. So to be able to be on this side of it, I find that the service that I provide oftentimes is to be a voice for the guys that are still in the fight, to be able to come out here and say, this is what's happening with Border Patrol that nobody's paying attention to. There's a suicide crisis. This is what's happening. This is the problem with Secret Service. This is the problem with management. To be able to say those things that other people can't say is a blessing as well.
100%. Like they need a voice. And it is so sad. Like I literally have the chills from all the things you're saying. It is so sad that you're saying that this is what I'm hearing on the news is like negative. And you've been there, you've seen the impact, like not just for a local community, like this is for the country. Like this is a large scale, like the difference that special agents make are large scale and also stopping future threats and if future terrorism from happening. It's such a big deal. And you using your voice is so important. So do you have any advice for someone like me or anybody who wants to get into like Homeland Security, for instance, or becoming a special agent?
And what I would say is there's more than one agency out there. I think a lot of people hear the term special agent, they assume FBI, right? Mm-hmm. And if you work, and I don't have anything bad to say about the FBI agents that I worked for. I might have criticism about the people who operate within the Beltway within Washington, D.C., but I worked with great agents from the FBI throughout my career. I worked with people who were some of the best criminal investigators I've ever worked with. And a lot of those people came out of local PDs. They came with that experience. I think what you see a lot of in that agency is you see two career paths. You see people who come out of law school, or you see people who come out of the ranks of a local PD. And the best agents that you're going to find are the criminal investigators who worked at a local PD because they know what they're doing right from the jump. And so what I would say, though, is if there's something you're passionate about, if you are really into gang investigations. Okay, well, the Bureau might be for you. If you were really into financial crimes, though, IRSCI or some of the OIGs, those smaller little niche agencies that deal with a certain aspect of federal criminal law, might provide the best opportunity for you to be a real all-star. The different Treasury agencies within the Inspector General, within the Treasury Inspector General, or the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration. There's all these tiny little agencies that have fewer than maybe 200 to 300 agents nationwide. So if you're in law enforcement, you have the opportunity to meet and work with some people from these smaller agencies and get a feel for what they do. If you're a detective or a criminal investigator, you have an opportunity to take a case federal, don't always go walking in the door of the FBI. I know that's what we all think of, but there's a lot of other agencies out there. Join task forces. If you can get on a HIDTA task force, you're going to meet a ton of people. I worked on a HIDTA task force for 3 years. It was awesome. Work on a SAR review task force, work on an elder fraud strike force. Something like that is going to expose you to other agents from other agencies. And you'll build those relationships. And then when they have vacancies and openings, you might be someone they think of because you have a skill set that matches what they're already doing. For people who are more generally interested in pursuing that 1811 career, that 1811 is the career code for special agent.
Yes.
If you're interested in just generally pursuing, probably the best agencies to get your foot in the door with are going to be HSI. They have national hirings a couple times a year. FBI is almost always hiring. Secret Service is always hiring. I would really caution you about the impact on your lifestyle if you take that job. That is it's a full-time commitment. It's very hard to have any life outside of that job. Same thing with air marshals. So those are difficult places to go, but they're always hiring. So if you want to get your foot in the door, get your start, if you're young, if you're in your 20s, you've got a clean background and you want to go that route, by all means, you're going to learn in dog years. You're going to learn a lot. Especially HSI, they're going to send you down to the Southwest border and you're going to learn like I did. You're going to have just, instead of catching dime bags of dope, you're going to have kilos coming across. You're going to have incredible amounts of opportunity to learn. But if I had to do it all over again, I would start as a deputy marshal. I would go with the U.S. Marshal Service. And the reason being, they, tactically speaking, they are they're enforcing blue warrants.
Write this down.
Yeah, they're enforcing all sorts of warrants. Usually they're doing all the arrests for DEA, plus they're doing anything that other DOJ entities send to them, fugitive operations. They're traveling around the world doing extraditions, bringing people in, and then they're doing court ops. So they're actually getting to see the court process from the moment you drop a prisoner off and book them in and do their buccal swabs and do all that stuff to them going through their initial appearance, going through their court appearance, and they're getting to know all the judges, all the magistrates, all the district court judges. So if you have that basis as a deputy U.S. Marshal, you are going to know more about the system, the federal law enforcement system, than just about anyone else, and you're going to be tactically sound. So if you start there, you go there for 2-3 years, and then you start looking at a more investigator-based position. That's how I do it.
Thank you for sharing all that, because a lot of my listeners are officers or aspiring officers, and I think a lot of us generally want to go, to become Homeland Security or DEA or FBI, and we start, like you said, at an agency. And like typically, if you don't want to stay at the agency, the next step is to go federal. And I really appreciate you sharing that advice, because I think a lot of my listeners will be really inspiring. And to be honest, I'm 32 years old. I've been in law enforcement for 6 years. And honestly, probably not up until like 8 months ago, I didn't know what 1811 meant, right. And I didn't know, like how you said, all the units. I because I've recently done my research, because I actually am looking to that career path, I truly did not know that there was like even local opportunities for me with, like you said, like my inspector general. Like I didn't know that there was this many opportunities. I had a friend recently leave Chicago Police Department, and she joined Homeland Security. She's my age, and I was really inspired by her making that move too. So I had been looking more into it, and there's so many more opportunities, even some local, because we're thinking like, okay, we have to leave everything, drop everything, like you said, move a million miles away, have no life. Like there is other opportunities that you don't have to go that route.
That's true.
Don't think about.
Yeah, a lot of folks, I mean, if you're going to go in so consider it this way, if you're going to go into HSI or DEA, so I had 4 out of like the 30 people at the HIDTA task force I worked for, 4 of them were former Chicago PD that were down in Brownsville, Texas, working.
Awesome.
Yeah, four of them. So, and so they all come down and they do their 2 or 3 or however many years in that location they have to, and then they get an opportunity after they become a GS-13, which is kind of like the journeyman level. They get to that higher level. Then they get the opportunity to open up for transfers to go to other places, sometimes foreign destinations. If you work for an HSI or an FBI or a DEA, you have the opportunity to work overseas at an attaché office, in an embassy somewhere. There's a lot of opportunities that you can have in your career if you want to travel and experience those things. But you're probably going to have to end up starting out in a border location. You're going to have to kind of suck it up and deal with being in a Brownsville, a McAllen, a Laredo, a Tucson, El Paso, whatever it is, for a period of time, typically 3 to 4 years. And then once you get off the border, now if you happen to live like I do in a Houston or a Chicago or a Miami or a Washington, D.C. or a New York, there's a ton of opportunities for you to stay right there, because those are high turnover offices where they tend to have trouble bringing people in at that base level salary because the cost of living adjustment. You know, if you're coming from like a small town in Ohio or whatever, and they drop you down in Manhattan, it's going to be culture shock. But if you're already there, you know, you can get that job pretty easily, and you can rise through the ranks with that agency. So get on USA Jobs, set those alerts on USA Jobs, get those messages when they come in, and be sure when you're applying, you're responding to the questions being asked in a very direct way to set yourself apart.
Yeah. Yeah. And like you said, she's able to stay in Chicago. She had to go to like Atlanta and Jersey for training, but I was so surprised that she got to stay in her home city, which is like, again, a lot of us don't know that.
You're going to have to spend 3 to 6 months in FLETC in South Georgia, or in Quantico. But in
Quantico.
You're going to have to.
I was actually going to go visit her, but I didn't have the chance. But yeah, she made it out alive, so that's good.
Yes.
So you've traveled the world. I've worked on some really serious cases, and I'm sure it's going to be impossible for you to pick out one, but if you could think of one on the top of your head, can you tell us a significant case or time within your career that you were involved in, and share a little story with us?
I mean, the most significant case I was involved in happened to be the largest telefraud case in U.S. history. So that's probably the one that was my career case. We were talking a little bit offline. A lot of my subjects were in the Chicago area, so I spent a lot of time up there between 2013 and 2016 doing surveillance in the western suburbs. I mean, there's probably not an apartment complex in like Aurora or Naperville that I haven't.
Which is so crazy to me, because it's like such a nice suburb, but like these big things are going on. It's so wild.
Yeah, these are all money laundering crimes. So what we had in that case was, if you've ever gotten a call from someone saying, this is the IRS, you owe us money, you need to pay us money, that was the case. The guys were at a call center in India, and they were calling into anybody in the United States, and they were threatening them with arrest or deportation in some cases if they didn't pay these quote-unquote fines. And at first we thought, because they were targeting visa holders from India, at first we thought this must be like an internal thing. It must be someone in DHS who's doing this. And that's how I got involved. And what we found out really quickly was this was just a massive conspiracy. So I worked with a Secret Service, I worked with Treasury Department, I worked with HSI, worked with Naperville PD, Hoffman Estates PD, some of those other PDs, and we put this case together that ended up indicting 56 individuals and 5 call centers in India. And we did a single takedown after 3 years of investigation, of traveling all over the country. We did a single takedown nationally about a week before the 2016 election. So this didn't make as much news as it could have, because things got crazy a couple days later. But we arrested 25 individuals across 8 states all at once, including about 6 or 7 arrests in the Chicagoland area. We arrested people down in Fort Myers, Florida, Phoenix, Arizona. I mean, you name it, we were all over the place, and picked up all these guys. And collectively, they are doing about 200 years in federal prison for all these guys. And then finally, after all that was done, after we made all those arrests, and all of these guys, almost all of them, all but like one, were Indian nationals who had come to the United States on visas. So getting back to why I got into law enforcement, people coming here, taking advantage of that system. They all came here on visas and then overstayed those visas, and then used their connections to these call centers in India to money launder the proceeds of this scam. So U.S. citizens would get one of these phone calls. They would, go buy some gift cards and scratch off the numbers on the back and read them off to the callers. The callers would then redirect those funds to these runners that were located all over the country, but quite a few of them were in your area, up in Chicago. And then they would go and launder those proceeds by buying money orders and making bank deposits. And so we unraveled this entire scam. Arrested all these folks. They're collectively, I said, doing about 200 years in prison. At the end of it, I got to fly to Singapore because we had an Interpol hit out there on one of these guys who was kind of the godfather of the scam, the guy who created it. After all the dust had settled in the U.S., we had this guy on our indictment list, but the Indian government wasn't giving him or any of the people in India up. He made the bad mistake of flying to Singapore to open up some bank accounts. And when he did, our Interpol hit got him detained. And my team was actually able to fly over there, pick him up, bring him back to the U.S., and he's doing 20 years now. So
Wow.
yeah, in that case, if you're interested in learning more about it, Sony Music made a podcast in 2022 about it that was one of the most popular podcasts in the world for that year. It's called Chameleon Scam Likely. It's an 8-part podcast. It tells the entire story. I'm pretty much the protagonist.
Wow, that's so cool. I will definitely check it out.
So it's worth checking out. Chameleon Scam Likely.
Okay. Oh my gosh, that is so cool. Thank you for talking about that. Like that is so wild to me. And I think that like your experience with traveling all over is so cool. Like just from someone who hasn't been, I mean I've been to Mexico, but like does that really count? I think it's just so cool that a career can bring you those opportunities too, like did you have any when you went overseas for these jobs, did you ever have any downtime to like hang out or no?
Sometimes when I went to, like if I was with ICE and I was going on a deportation mission, so we would have an individual who had gone through the court process, he's ordered removed from the country, we're going to execute that warrant. But depending on their level, like if it's a felon, we're not going to let him fly alone. We're going to escort him all the way and turn him over at immigration in his home country. So I got to go to Frankfurt, Germany, which was beautiful. And I'd been there before as a private citizen, but, to be able to go, and then I would take annual leave while I was there. So I would take 2 days of leave while I was there. So the government paid for my flight over. They'll pay for my flight back. I just have to pay for my hotel while I'm there. So I did that. I did that in Portugal. I did that in London. So when I went to a place that was worth staying in, I would take a couple days of leave and explore. We did that in Singapore. Actually, Singapore, we were there for like 4 days, and a lot of that was meetings with the authorities there and the government, and going to the jail and getting briefed up by the Singapore police force. But we did have downtime. We did get to see some things. And most countries, though, I was out.
You're wanting to get right out, yeah.
Venezuela, I had a weird incident in Venezuela where I flew into Venezuela. This was when Hugo Chavez was in charge, and he was not a big fan of, at the time, President Bush. And we arrived, and it was really strange. We brought 2 people back to Venezuela, turned them over to the authorities there, and we were supposed to spend the night in Caracas and then fly back into Miami the next morning, and then make our way back to Texas. We ended up, the military met us. After we turned these guys over, the military met us, and I speak a little bit of Spanish, but I didn't speak enough Spanish to understand what was happening. One of my partners is fluent, and what he explained to me was the military was not going to let us leave the airport. We were going to stay in the waiting area in the airport. We weren't officially detained. I was never put in handcuffs or anything like that, but they basically said, your hotel is canceled. We're putting you on the first flight out. We don't want you here overnight. We don't want you, you're American government operatives, basically. They were kind of treating us that way. And so we said, oh, okay. So we stayed in the airport overnight, and the first flight out in the morning, which was not our original flight, they were like there to escort us onto the plane to Miami and send us back. So, that stuff happened too. I mean, you go to Nicaragua, and nobody wants you there either. So
wild. Like
so
that
depends,
is so...
It depends on where you go.
Wow. So interesting. Your kids, we'll talk about it in a second, but I'm sure you have so many stories to tell your kids. Maybe not like the scary ones yet, but that is so cool. So you have a podcast.
Yeah.
How did you decide to start it? I'm assuming after talking to you, it's to share these stories and be that voice. But how did you decide to start it, and how did you come up with that title? If you could tell us the title, The Indispensable Man. And
it's changed, but yeah, we'll get to it.
Okay. Yeah. So that's why I said, if you could tell us how you came up with that title and what does it mean to you?
Yeah. So originally when I got out of law enforcement, that word indispensable means a lot to me. And the reason it means a lot to me is because when I first started as a special agent, I was down the U.S.-Mexico border. I was like the only blue-eyed white boy in my office. And so, not being like a native Spanish speaker, basically knowing, law enforcement Spanish, firma aquí, all that stuff, manos arriba, the basics that are going to get you through an arrest. That kind of put me at a disadvantage in terms of being a very effective agent. I wasn't able to run CIs by myself. I wasn't able to go undercover by myself. Now, I did, like, the times that I went undercover was when I worked for HIDA, and they would have like spring break at South Padre Island, and they needed like the blue-eyed white boy to go and pretend that he was like the college kid so he could ask the cabbie where to find drugs. But
that's hilarious. That's hilarious.
But for the most part, I couldn't run the ops that some of my colleagues could run, and I ended up being like second chair in a lot of interviews, taking notes, and I wanted to be useful, and so that word indispensable meant a lot to me. It meant making yourself irreplaceable, and so I looked at what our investigative purview was, and I said, listen, nobody's really taking fraud cases. Everybody wants to do the hot shot, like undercover stuff. I'm good with numbers. I'm good at that stuff. I'm good at following the money. Bring me all the fraud cases, which is how I ended up getting on that case that turned into the largest telefraud case in U.S. history. And so for me, it was finding a niche. And I think this is advice for your listeners: is find a niche. Don't be like everybody else. There's plenty of people out there who want to chase drugs and do X, Y, and Z, and they're great at it. Find a way that you can make yourself stand out from what everybody else is doing and really lean into that. Make yourself a subject matter expert on something, and you will be irreplaceable. You will be somebody that will always be busy, that will always have good work. You will always be asked to come and train others and teach others. And that's what I wanted to be. And so I kind of created that for myself. And when I came out of law enforcement, I hadn't been able to scratch a creative itch in my entire career, because you're not really online and all that stuff. And so, my wife suggested, why don't you, you were a writer, you worked for your newspaper in college, you did that. That was your history before you did this. You've always talked about writing a book. Why don't you write a book? And so I wrote a book, and I called it Indispensable because I wanted to teach some of the same tactics that I used to create that role for myself. And I wanted people to be able to apply that same sort of tactical plan to whatever aspect of their life they wanted to make themselves more indispensable in. And so that was my first book. And I kind of had a podcast that corresponded with that. And then with my new book that came out, I've talked about the importance of Stoic philosophy in my life. And so I kind of rebranded the podcast to correspond with that book. And the podcast is now called the Stoic Responder Podcast. And I talk about mindset and philosophy based on Stoic philosophy and how I applied that in my career. So just trying to give tools to other people that they can take, and they can maybe learn something that they didn't know, and trying to distill some of these lessons that I learned in 15 years in law enforcement into easily digestible bites that other people can take and say, hey, maybe this provides me a shortcut. I don't have to bang my head against the wall, for 5 years in this job, when I can read this chapter of this book and get a better idea that might get me to the front of the line quicker.
Yeah. Yeah. Because my next question was about your books. And I had a instructor in the academy that talked about Stoicism a lot.
Oh, wow.
And I find it so interesting. And I think it's really cool that you talk about Stoicism, you talk about meditation for first responders. You talk openly about, being vulnerable, being a family man, like about your life in your first book. And for the second book, the Tactical Plan for the Modern Man, can you talk about how you decided to make a book that teaches like Stoicism and meditation and stuff like that? Because I know we talked about it earlier, a lot of men may not want to be like, I won't do meditation or whatever. So I think it's cool that you are opening that door for other men. So what inspired you to make that second book?
So that second book, so the first book is Indispensable. The second book is In Valor. And the second book, it's based on, so you mentioned Stoicism. And for those that don't know, Stoicism is a 2,000-year-old plus philosophy, right? It was founded in Athens by Zeno, this guy Zeno, who was a philosophy student. And the whole purpose of the philosophy is to separate in your life that which you control from that which you do not, and to focus on the things that you control. What is within my purview? What do I control? I don't control the politics of the office. I don't control, what call I get sent on. I don't control any of these things. I control my attitude, my actions, my reactions, my emotions. Those are within my control. And if I control those things, I can live a virtuous life. And I found that applying that to my career made my career longevity greater. It made me show up with a better attitude. It made me less likely to get involved in the things that were going to bring me down from an attitude perspective, and to control what I could control. Focus on the things that were in my purview, work hard, be dedicated to those things that I control, and you're going to get more done and have a better career. And you're going to have better home life or work-life balance as well if you're considering those things. I find that so many people in law enforcement get caught up in the everything else, the bitching and the moaning and the complaining and all that stuff, which is, there are legitimate complaints, don't get me wrong. But all that stuff takes you away from the main thing. And the main thing is what's within your control and your ability to control. And if we can remember that, it helps us keep that our emotions better regulated, and we're more regulated emotionally. We have better response with the public. We have a better way of handling our business. We show up with better energy. We get burned out less frequently. And so that book really was written for me at age 26, 27 when I started law enforcement. I said, what tools do I wish had been discussed at the academy that I wish I had throughout my career that I had to find on my own? And how can I provide that to someone else so that they have this? And what it is it's a 365-day book where every single day you open a page and you've got 3 or 4 paragraphs. You've got a quote from one of the great Stoic philosophers giving you something to think about. And then I try to put it in modern context in the next 3 or 4 paragraphs. And then I leave you with a journal prompt so you can integrate that lesson. You can think about it. You can kind of meditate. You can have some mindfulness and you can practice. And if you do this every day, I guarantee you your mindset's going to improve. I guarantee you you're going to be more in tune and aware of where you are emotionally. You're going to go into your shift with a better attitude. And to me, that was important. So I've seen the benefits of it. I've seen the benefits of journaling, of meditation, of mindfulness, of taking those moments to center yourself and get right with yourself, because we've all been there. We've all lost control of our emotions. We've all felt that burnout coming on. We've all felt like you're going to show up to this call on an 8. And when you show up to a call on an 8 instead of a 2 or a 1, there's so much less room for error. Things are going to escalate so much more quickly. I think one great example of that a lot of people have been citing online recently is what happened in Miami with Tyreek Hill. Now, I think we can all say, like, constitutionally, he was probably within his rights to remove him from the car and to do what he did. But one officer came in with level 8 energy and the others were probably at 2 or 3, right? And you saw the emotional difference in those responses. Well, what if we're practicing and being conscious about where we are emotionally, recognizing what's impacting, affecting us? Am I letting all these additional stressors burn me out and bother me? Is this going to explode on somebody else and how I operate today? And that's really what it was about for me, was really making sure that we were focusing on the things that we do control, our actions, our attitudes, our reactions, our emotions, and really being right with ourselves first before we go out into the field and try to do this job.
Yeah, I think it's so important. And I think that especially too, like us, like road patrol cops, like you said, like just going into your day or your shift with a better mindset, taking 5 minutes out of your day. I've been trying to be more mindful about that, trying to just breathe more, relax more. And like you said, focus on what I can control and let go of what I can't. So I'm definitely going to recommend your book.
I appreciate that. We do. One thing I love to tell people, if I can, is when we go into a house, when we run a search warrant, we do a threshold check, right? We do a threshold assessment. Like when we hit a door, that's an opportunity for us to take a quick breath, check where we're at, what's our surroundings. We wait for that squeeze on the shoulder for that next move before you're going to clear that next room. We need to be doing that in our personal lives as well, right? And this is an opportunity to do that. It's an opportunity to take a few minutes and just read a page and integrate it and deal with that lesson. That's just a threshold check. That's all it is. So maybe before you come into the door at the end of your shift and you're going to transition from being a mom or a dad, or from being an officer into a mom or a dad, maybe that's a good time to, have that book in your car, or have something, a journal in your car, put something down in that journal, check in with yourself before you bring that energy into your house, right? We're used to going in and trying to calm every scene. And that's why I think so many of us have problems at home, because, we come in like, I'm the one with the badge and I'm the one who's going to solve all these problems, instead of doing that threshold check and centering ourselves and recognizing that it's time to take the duty belt off. That's not who I am right now. And so I hope this provides people that opportunity.
100%. Like, you don't need to be an officer at home. You could take that off and just be, it is hard. Yeah, it is. It's definitely hard. And I'm engaged to another police officer.
So yeah, you get it. Yeah.
Yeah, I do get it. So you've written books, you have a podcast, you're a public speaker, you teach mindset and tactics, resilience. What goals do you have for the future, and what can we expect from you? You've already done so much, so I'm like, what more can you possibly do? But do you have?
I just want to be a good dad.
Trying to tackle? Yeah, I love that.
And I just want to be like my girls, and you've been on my Instagram, I'm sure you've seen that my girls are both adopted. We got to them a little bit later in life. My youngest, we got to her when she was 3 years old. Both my girls are special needs. They're both from China. So my 3-year-old, we got to her, I missed all the good stuff, right? All the little kid stuff by the time we got to her. And then my older daughter, we didn't get to her until she was 6.5. And so, I dealt with a lot of guilt in the later stages of my career because I was on the road so much. I was chasing down that big case. I would be on the road 3 or 4 nights out of the week. And I felt like I was missing out on a part of their lives when I'd already missed out on so much of it. And so for me, whatever I do, it's being able to be focused on my family first and being an asset to my family instead of a liability. And so that means, making sure that I'm staying on point with my fitness, making sure I'm staying on point with my mindset and being able to be there for them every step of the way so that they never have to be put to bed at night without me there. They never have to wake up and not have me there to cook them breakfast. And so that's my primary focus. And everything that I've built in my post-law enforcement career has been with that in mind. The public speaking, the things that I get to do to speak to others, the things that I get to do from an entrepreneurial perspective, all of that is my core purpose and my core why is to be able to be family first. And so far, so good. So, whatever I do down the road, whether it's to continue writing books or doing the podcast or public speaking or in-person training, all of that's going to be with an eye towards being there for those little girls, no matter what.
I love that. And I really appreciate that. And I think it's really good for my listeners to hear too, because that is at the end of the day, the most important, because in this career, anything can happen at any day, anytime. I mean, you can get injured, you can get fired. I mean, you can be on leave, and like, who's going to be there for you when that happens? And that's your family.
Right. Right.
So if someone visits your page, reads your book, listens to your podcast, what do you hope they take away from it?
I hope that I can speak with a voice that that makes them feel seen. Everybody wants to be seen, validated, and heard. That's anybody. Yeah. And you deal with victims all the time in your job. I dealt with victims. I had over 17,000 victims on that big case, most of them elderly. And every one of them, to their core, they wanted to be seen, validated, and heard. If you can and I feel like in law enforcement, there's not enough people that are providing that to law enforcement, right? They've been, especially in the last 10 years, have been vilified so much. They've been treated and othered so much. They've been blamed for all of society's ills when they're the people that are enforcing the policies, not the ones writing them, not the ones passing the laws. They're out there doing the hardest job imaginable, and they get no support from the people that they're protecting. And they're the first ones thrown on the bus from the people who wrote the laws that they're enforcing. So people want to be seen, validated, and heard. And if I can provide some of that validation, if I can make someone feel seen, and then they can turn to the stuff that I'm writing or speaking about, and they can gain something from it that helps them in their career and their personal lives, that helps them survive this job, then that's what I hope they get from it. Yeah,
I appreciate that. That's awesome. And where can we find you online? Give us your plugs. Give us all you got.
Yeah, you can find on Instagram, I'm probably most active there at team_Healey. That's spelled Healey. And if you look up the Stoic Responder, you'll find my podcast, you'll find my YouTube, you'll find my Substack. You'll find all of that is for free. I give out 4 episodes a week. They're between about 8 to 15 minutes long, and it's just kind of discussing mindset issues that hopefully you can take with you. If you're not big on reading, get it through the podcast. Yeah, get it through the podcast.
I love that. Okay, you guys, give him a follow. This was a great listen, honestly, for me too. Like this is like perfect for me to listen. I feel motivated. I feel like I want to go meditate or do some yoga, but also you guys can get his book right on Amazon, because I did. So you can get it right off Amazon. Check out his podcast. And can you tell us that podcast again that is about that case that you worked on again?
Yes, it's called Chameleon Scam Likely. So it's the series is called Chameleon. I think I was like season 2, but it's called Chameleon Scam Likely. It's eight episodes long, and you can get the entire breakdown on how the IRS scam happened and how we caught the guys.
That's so cool. I'm definitely going to do that too. So thank you so much for being here in your busy schedule. And in your dad era, your dad life. I really appreciate it. And thank you for your voice and all you've done for our community. And I really, really appreciate you. Keep doing what you're doing.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.